Imagine this. A former military pilot, black belt in martial arts, boards a massive FedEx cargo jet, not to deliver packages, but to die. He's calm, he's focused, and he's carrying a bag full of weapons. But here's the catch. He's not alone. 3 crew members are flying with him, totally unaware that in just minutes, they'll be fighting for their lives, 30,000 feet above the ground. It's the morning of April 7th, 1994. A DC-10 cargo plane approaches the runway at Memphis International Airport. Everything looks routine. The runway's clear, the tower's waiting, nothing seems off. Until the jet suddenly jerks upward, flips sideways, and begins a terrifying dive toward the Earth at over 535 miles per hour. This isn't turbulence. This isn't engine failure. This is war in the sky. Then comes the chilling radio call. Center, we have an emergency. Express 705. We've been attacked. Trying to control the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, chaos, blood, screams. 3 men fighting a man who's trained to kill, while also trying to stop the plane from slamming into the ground and exploding into a giant fireball. This isn't just another hijacking. This was a suicide mission, and it nearly worked. This is the true story of Flight 705. When a FedEx employee tried to bring down his own company from 35,000 feet in the air. A story that'll leave you shocked, disturbed, and wondering, how did anyone survive this? FedEx, Federal Express, wasn't a passenger airline. It was strictly for cargo. That's why their flight crews usually consisted of just 2 people, a captain and a first officer. But back in the 90s, most commercial planes still needed a 3rd person in the cockpit, a flight engineer. Because planes back then weren't as high-tech as they are now. Their systems were complicated, and having an engineer on board was crucial to keep things running smoothly mid-air. One of those engineers was Auburn Calloway. He worked for FedEx and, like the rest of the crew, was on a rotating schedule. But in aviation, schedules aren't just about shifts. They're about flight hours, the total time crew members spend in the air. Once they hit the limit, they're required, by law, to rest. On April 6th, just 1 day before the incident, Calloway flew a trip with another crew. That crew barely, by 1 minute, went over their maximum allowed hours. Even though Calloway himself technically didn't exceed the limit, regulations forced him to rest anyway, because he was part of that same flight, which meant, legally, he couldn't fly the next day. But on April 7th, Calloway decided to ignore that rule. He filed a request to hitch a ride on the next flight, saying he had personal business in another state. And FedEx had an internal policy that let employees catch free rides on cargo planes, as long as there was space. In cases like that, the employee is called a deadhead, a non-working crew member who's just along for the ride. No duties, no responsibilities, just a seat. But Calloway was determined to be on that plane, no matter what. That morning, he was the first to board. He came with a normal-looking suitcase and a guitar case. Nothing suspicious, nothing out of the ordinary. Next came Andrew Peterson, the scheduled flight engineer. He wasn't surprised to see Calloway. They worked at the same company, saw each other all the time. He knew Calloway wasn't officially on the crew, just deadheading. But then, something weird caught Peterson's eye. The cockpit voice recorder, the one that records all in-flight conversations, was switched off, and that recorder is part of the black box. It's supposed to be on at all times. Peterson found it strange, But thinking it was probably a mistake, he turned it back on, set it to the correct mode, then shrugged it off. Soon after, Captain David Sanders and First Officer James Tucker arrived. They greeted Calloway casually. No red flags. Just another FedEx guy catching a ride. The crew began prepping the cockpit for takeoff, but they forgot to lock the cockpit door. At exactly 3 p.m., FedEx Flight 705 took off, climbing smoothly into the sky until it reached 18,000 feet. 26 minutes later, Calloway opened the guitar case, but there was no guitar inside. Instead, he pulled out a heavy hammer, a Gerber Mark II combat knife, and a crossbow. This wasn't just a flight. This was the start of a nightmare. The cockpit voice recordings after that point? They're fragmented, chaotic, scattered with random words about positions and terrain, like the crew was trying to act normal, or maybe throw Calloway off, or maybe they were planning something, right in the middle of the madness. Most likely, Auburn Calloway was trying to make small talk, trying to mask his true intentions behind casual chit-chat and fake smiles. He asked one of the pilots, 9 and 2 here. You live in Arkansas, Dave? Captain Sanders replied, Nope, I live in Fisherville. Calloway smiled and said, Fisherville, nice place. Trees dance there. And then, without warning, he attacked. Calloway came from behind and swung the hammer hard at flight engineer Andrew Peterson. Peterson didn't even see it coming. As he turned to figure out what the noise was, bam, a brutal blow hit the left side of his head. Then Calloway turned to his next target, First Officer James Tucker. He smashed him so hard, one of the blows actually fractured his skull, and fragments pierced into his brain. Captain David Sanders tried to fight back, but got struck so violently it left deep cuts on his head and ear. His ear was nearly ripped off his skull. The cockpit turned into absolute hell. The hammer came down again and again. None of them could process what was happening. They were dazed, in agony, and somehow still alive. After his first brutal assault, Calloway moved to the rear galley. He went back to grab his second weapon, a hunting crossbow. Those few seconds, that tiny pause, gave the crew a chance. Captain Sanders unbuckled and began crawling, bleeding, toward the cockpit. Peterson and Tucker were slowly regaining consciousness, but then Calloway came back, and when he did, he pointed the crossbow right at Sanders. Just before he could shoot, Peterson lunged at him, trying to wrestle the weapon away. Sanders jumped in too, and then, despite his severe injuries, despite being partially paralyzed on his right side, Tucker decided he had to do something. That's when he realized. His hand was still gripping the yoke, and in that moment, he made a choice. He thought, why not use the plane to fight back? So he yanked the yoke hard, pulling the nose up at a steep 15-degree angle on purpose to throw everyone off balance and flip the fight. It worked. Calloway, Sanders, and Peterson were tossed out of the cockpit, slamming down the narrow hallway, all the way into the rear galley. Now the fight was hand-to-hand, cramped, brutal. Tucker, who was now flying the plane manually, wasn't just a pilot. He was also a former Navy man, combat-trained, and in that moment, his instincts kicked in. The best defense is a relentless offense. While the chaos raged in the back, Tucker took it further. He rolled the aircraft into a near inversion. The DC-10 tilted so hard, the fight literally flipped to the ceiling. It was no longer a battle on the floor. It was now a fight on the roof of the aircraft. But that insane maneuver came at a price. Peterson and Sanders, already badly hurt, were injured even more. It wasn't just Calloway who hit the floor. Everyone did. Still, Calloway got back up, made his way back to the cockpit, and landed another devastating blow to Captain Sanders. One that partially crushed his skull and left him with partial paralysis on his right side. At the height of the madness, the aircraft went into a near vertical dive. The speedometer read 535 miles per hour, but in reality, it was even faster. No DC-10 had ever reached this speed, or taken this kind of violent beating. The tail stabilizers shook violently, almost tearing off. The entire aircraft was seconds away from structural failure. Tucker knew it. So he leveled the plane, eased the throttle, saved the aircraft from breaking apart mid-air. But that sudden maneuver threw Calloway off balance again, sending him crashing back toward the rear of the plane, where Peterson and Sanders, still bleeding, still fighting, waited for him. Then came another round. Calloway struck one of them hard in the head. The other was losing massive amounts of blood, but neither of them gave up. And the fight still wasn't over. As Captain Tucker fought to bring the plane back under control, Captain Sanders managed to wrestle one of the hammers out of Calloway's hands and hit him twice, using every last ounce of strength he had left. Meanwhile, Tucker grabbed the radio and called Memphis Air Traffic Control. His voice was shaking, full of tension and pain. Even with the sounds of chaos and fighting behind him, he stayed focused and made a terrifying call. He requested armed intervention. That's not a small request. That's one of the most extreme emergencies a pilot can declare mid-flight. Immediately, the control center went on high alert. Emergency response teams at Memphis International Airport jumped into full readiness. Runways were cleared. Rescue and fire units were deployed. And while all that was happening, Tucker, bleeding and barely conscious, kept fighting the controls, turning the plane left and right, refusing to let Calloway take over. Calloway was still raging in the back. But then, finally, Sanders landed a crushing blow to Calloway's head, a second, brutal hit. And it worked. Calloway went down, pinned, for the first time in what felt like forever. There was silence. Then Peterson and Sanders called out from the back, using the cockpit intercom. "Jim, come to the galley. Turn on autopilot and get back here, now." Tucker responded. He disengaged manual controls and activated the autopilot. But now there was a new problem. The plane had drifted far off course, and no one was answering on the radio. Despite partial paralysis, Tucker crawled toward the back of the aircraft, dragging himself down the aisle. And when he got there, he was stunned. The galley was wrecked. His crewmates, barely recognizable, covered in blood. Calloway was on the floor, restrained, barely moving. Sanders went back to the cockpit to try and regain control of the plane, while the others made sure Calloway stayed down. They called out to Tucker for help. But when they saw him, they realized he could barely help himself. Still, despite his injuries, Sanders returned to the captain's seat, trying to line up the approach to Memphis. He grabbed what weapons he could off the floor, the ones Calloway had used, but couldn't carry all of them. Half his body was numb. He radioed the tower again, and this time, they were ready. Emergency crews, fire trucks, medics, all waiting on the ground. But here's the twist. The plane was 16 tons over the safe landing weight. Why? Because it was loaded with a full tank of fuel. Fuel that was supposed to burn off on a long flight to San Jose. But the plane had been in the air less than an hour. It was still dangerously heavy. That meant, if they landed with that weight, the tires could explode on impact. And if that happened, the sparks could ignite the fuel, a literal fireball, and through all this, Calloway was still screaming. His voice echoed from the galley all the way to the cockpit, loud, Madam Relentless. At 7,000 feet, Captain Sanders made a critical decision. He shut off the autopilot, adjusted the aircraft's attitude, and left the cockpit again, making his way back to the others. He had one goal: neutralize Calloway for good, to make sure nothing went wrong on landing. But when he got there, he realized Tucker had already done it. Calloway was restrained, tight, totally under control. At that point, killing him wasn't necessary anymore. But those few seconds, the time Sanders spent walking back, they delayed the descent. They made the landing even harder. And maybe they changed everything. The plane was still running on autopilot. Same speed, same altitude. But as it got closer to Memphis, it had already missed runway 9. There was no turning back. So Captain Sanders made a split-second life-or-death call. Whatever it takes, I'm landing on runway 36 left. But to reach it, he'd have to pull off a near-impossible maneuver. A sharp 90-degree right turn, followed by a full 180, all while descending at insane speeds, with a plane 16 tons over the safe landing weight. And he had to touch down smoothly, because a rough landing could cause the tires to explode. And with all that unburned fuel on board, the whole plane could go up in flames. Worse, he had to stop the plane completely before the runway ended. And this wasn't just any plane. This was a fully loaded DC-10 cargo jet. Oh, and by the way, Sanders himself was barely holding it together. One ear was almost ripped off. His jaw was dislocated, his face covered in blood. But despite all that, he ignored the warnings. He overrode the systems. And against all odds, he landed it. The tires didn't blow. He stopped the aircraft with just 1,000 feet to spare. And as that massive jet came rolling to a halt, Calloway was still trying to crawl across the galley, reaching for a hammer on the floor. But he never got to it. Peterson beat him to it, grabbed the hammer, and landed one last blow. Calloway dropped, silent. As emergency crews rushed in, the very first thing they did was cuff Calloway. It was over. The crew was safe. A deadly hijacking, stopped by a miracle. But the damage? Devastating. Peterson had lost so much blood his pulse was almost unreadable. He was rushed to the ER. Tucker had a fractured skull, bone shards pierced his brain. And yet, he was still fighting to stay alive. Captain Sanders, somehow still able to walk, was in terrible shape. He and Tucker were placed in the same ambulance. As for Calloway, he was taken to the hospital too, in handcuffs. And then came the question, why? Why did Auburn Calloway do this? What drove him to carry out such a violent, suicidal plan? There was a time in his life when things weren't so bad. He wasn't rich, but he was ambitious. He graduated from Stanford, majoring in African American history. Later, he joined the military, became a skilled pilot. He built a family. His life seemed to be on the right track. But after leaving the military, he applied to FedEx. Even though he was qualified to be a pilot, they didn't offer him a captain's seat. They offered him a lesser position, flight engineer, with lower pay. Calloway believed the company discriminated against him because of his race. But he didn't complain. He needed the job. So he took it. That's where the downhill spiral began. He was unhappy at work, unfulfilled in life. Later, he got divorced. And despite his limited salary, he tried hard to support his kids. He wanted them to go to college. Then came the final blow. In 1994, FedEx discovered that Calloway had lied on his resume. He had faked his flight hours. He knew he was about to be fired. He felt like a failure, like he'd never be able to give his kids a future, like he was worthless as a father. And that's when he made his decision. He was going to end it all. But not just any death. He wanted to die loudly inside a FedEx jet as a FedEx employee. Calloway had a $2.5 million life insurance policy. But here's the catch. That payout only happens if the death occurs while on duty in a workplace accident. And he thought it through. If he died inside a FedEx plane during a shift, it'd count. His kids would get the money. To him, that was enough to secure their future. A future he didn't believe he could provide anymore. And so, his dark plan began. FedEx had scheduled a disciplinary hearing for April 8, 1994. And the day before that, April 7th, he planned to end his life inside a FedEx jet. He smuggled on board 4 hammers, a hunting knife, and a crossbow. His plan? Attack the crew, take over the plane, crash it, burn it all, leave no evidence. Because in a fiery crash, no one would ever know what really happened. No one would find the weapons. No one would find the truth. If everything went his way, his family would get that $2.5 million. Everyone would think it was just a tragic accident. But something changed. The day before the flight, Calloway was scheduled to fly with his usual crew, a man and a woman. But they had exceeded their flight hour limit by just 1 minute, 1 single minute. So FedEx grounded them. They were replaced by a new crew, 3 men. Calloway didn't expect that, but he didn't back down either. He told himself, if I can kill 2, I can kill 3. On the morning of April 7th, 1994, he wrote a will and left it on his bed, packed his weapons, and headed to Memphis International Airport. He even left a note to his ex-wife. I prefer to choose the time, place, and method. And long ago I decided, if my future and peace are threatened, I will leave. Fighting. But fate had other plans. The sheer willpower of Peterson, Tucker, and Sanders, their fight to survive, to outfly, to outlast, was legendary. Tucker underwent 3 major brain surgeries. It took him 2.5 years just to learn how to walk and talk again, sadly. None of the 3 were ever medically cleared to fly again. But something incredible did come out of it. A lifelong bond and a national honor. They received the Gold Medal for Heroism from the Airline Pilots Association, the highest civilian award a pilot can receive in the U.S. As for Calloway, he was charged with attempted air piracy. He tried to play the insanity card, claimed he wasn't in his right mind, said he didn't remember planning anything. But the court didn't buy it. He was found guilty and sentenced to 209 years in federal prison. No parole, 2 life terms, plus 4 consecutive sentences. Because this wasn't just about killing a crew. The survivors testified that Calloway planned to crash the plane into FedEx headquarters at Memphis Airport, which could have caused mass destruction, mass casualties, and wiped out the company's core operations. And the scary part is, it could have worked. If he had flown with his original crew, a man and a woman, the outcome might have been completely different. Calloway wasn't just some random guy. He was nearly 6 feet 3 inches, held a black belt in martial arts, and came fully armed. He expected to win. But the last-minute crew change, that changed everything. This was today's story, a wild one, but 100% true. Once again proving there's no such thing as the perfect crime. If you thought this was intense, you won't want to miss the story of the deadly Tokyo subway sarin gas attack, or the shy kid who built a criminal empire from his bedroom. I'll see you in the next story.